Hello to our friends who are joining us via recording. Today is April 15th. We are covering the first part of lesson number 12 about the spinal cord. So we're going to go ahead and just jump straight into some of the pictures that we have when we talk about your lesson number 12 outline. So one of the first things that we bump into in lesson number 12 is reminding us to compare and contrast the white matter and the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now, remember how yesterday in office hours I told you guys if we do the lab stuff first, that's going to help us a lot with the lecture stuff. So let's do a little bit of lab review here. I've got a very simplified version of a cross section here of the spinal cord. I'm looking inside the spinal cord here. I want us to label together some of the structures that we see here. So let me draw some lines, and then we're going to put some word labels next to these lines here. All right, so let's start with my line here in the front. We are looking at part of the spinal cord that's made out of white matter. When I talk about the part of the spinal cord that's made out of white matter, does anyone remember the word that we used in the lab packet to describe white matter? It's kind of a funky word. Or if you remember from yesterday's office hours, what I told you could say instead of that word. Yeah, so Kathleen typed for us the weird word that you will see on the lab homework, or that you saw on the lab homework, or seeing this week I think, that you see on the lab homework. So technically, in lab, we're calling the white matter funiculi. Here in lecture, because I like English words better than Latin words, in lecture here, I'm going to call these guys tracts. Funiculi and tracts are exactly the same thing. All of the white matter of the spinal cord is filled with these tracts, filled with these funiculi. All that funiculi are is it's places in the spinal cord where a group of neurons or their axons all shoot straight up or they all shoot straight down. So if you ever see on the homework an arrow, the lab homework, and it's pointing to somewhere in the white matter, anywhere in the white matter of the spinal cord, we were always going to call that a white matter funiculus or one of these tracts because they're found everywhere. All right, next structure, and we're going to see if we can remember here. When we talk about the spinal cord, we have these structures here made out of gray matter. There's 3 of them made out of gray matter. What was the name of the gray matter, these little structures that we see here in the spinal cord? So one of us chimed in with the general name for them. Yeah, the general name for each of these gray matter parts here, each of these parts of the gray matter are what we call horns. So I have 3 different horns when I look at the gray matter of the spinal cord. They are named based on whether they're in the front, in the back, or whether they're on the side. Now, I did have a discussion, I think we mentioned this yesterday. I'm going to mention it again today. You will see that some terminology on the labeled images versus your lab packet is a little bit different. We're talking about synonyms here. So for example, we are having you label what's called the dorsal gray horn. The dorsal gray horn. When you look at the labeled images that we provided you, the word dorsal is the same thing, yeah, like Pilar said, as posterior. So posterior gray horn, dorsal gray horn, they're exactly the same thing. It varies from textbook to textbook. So the dorsal gray horn, that's what we're calling it in our class. It's the same thing as those things that are labeled as the posterior gray horn. Then we have what we're calling the ventral gray horn. The ventral gray horn. On some of those labeled images, you're going to see that one called the anterior gray horn. Yeah, ventral is the same thing as anterior. If you care at all, probably most of us don't care, but this part here, this ventral word, ventral comes from venter, which means the belly side. So your belly is on the front of your body. This dorsal word here comes from dorsum, which means it's on the backside of your body. So if we're thinking about anterior and posterior, those directional terms from lab, ventral, or the belly side, is the one that's on the front. Dorsal, or the back side, is the one that's on the back. So the terminology here, these are going to be a little bit different in some of those labeled images. And then, of course, we have our last horn, which is correctly for us. That's the lateral gray horn, which is always called lateral, because lateral means that we're on the side. So there's not another way to explain that one. Excuse me. All right, so I've got three gray horns, or three places in the spinal cord where I arrange my gray matter here. So when I am talking about this one right here, which of those three horns would I call this one right here when I'm looking in my spinal cord? Can we tell which one that one is? Yeah, that is my dorsal horn. So the one here in the back is going to be my dorsal horn, or my dorsal gray horn. Dorsal horn, I'm going to type faster. So my dorsal horn is on the back side. Some of the hints that you had in your guided lesson about the dorsal horn, how to tell that that's the dorsal side. First way to tell is that the dorsal horn either all the way touches the outside of the spinal cord, or it's really close. So goes far back, we'll say. I'm not sure a good way to describe it. But the fact that, see how this is really close to the edge of the spinal cord, whereas this one up here, there's more space. The other way that we could determine that this is the back side is there's not the back side of the spinal cord has what's called the dorsal median sulcus. Dorsal median sulcus, this little thing right here, as opposed to my ventral median fissure that's a little bit wider back here. So the back side of the spinal cord, there's not as much open space back here, but really your big tip-off for identifying it is the horn goes really close to the back side of the spinal cord. That's the best way to tell. So if this is the dorsal gray horn, what's this one right here called? What's this horn here on the other side of the spinal cord? Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in for me. This one is the one on the front side. Apologize. Turn. There we go. That one is called the ventral gray horn, or the ventral horn for simplicity's sake. Ventral horn, if I could spell. So we got the dorsal horn on the back side. This one almost touches the edge of the spinal cord. The ventral horn here in the front with a lot more space that's there, which means that the last one that I have left is the only one we haven't talked about the labeling. The last one over here then is called the, what do we call this last one? The last one that I find on the side of the spinal cord. Exactly. Yep, the one that I find on the side of the spinal cord is called the lateral horn. Typically, I'm not going to ask you to identify these horns in lecture, because that's mostly a lab thing. But why it's helpful for us to review this, number one, because that's our lab topic this week, right? But number two, as we're getting ready to talk about different kinds of neurons live in these different places here. So we want to know where those horns are, because when I tell you that the ones that live in the lateral horn do this, and the ones that live in the ventral horn do that, we want to know where we're talking about in the spinal cord. Okay, so we've labeled our gray matter here. We've labeled our white matter that's on the outside of the spinal cord. Let's do a reminder for ourselves. When we talked about the brain, so think back to lesson number 11, when we talked about the brain, on the outside of the brain, did we mostly have white matter or gray matter on the outside of the brain? Yeah, for the most part, on the outside of the brain, actually everywhere, it's not for the most part, it's everywhere. The outside of the brain is covered with gray matter. And then we've got a bunch of white matter in the middle. And then if you remember, there were a few things. We'll type their names up here. Basal nuclei. There were a few places in the very middle of the brain where I also had gray matter, but most of the gray matter of the brain was on the outside. So the basal nuclei are the exception to that rule. That's where my gray matter is found, in the very middle of the spinal cord. When we look at, of the brain, sorry. When we look at the spinal cord, it's flipped. So on the very outside of the spinal cord is my white matter. In the very middle of the spinal cord is the gray matter. It's always going to be that way. As a reminder for us, I kept in our image here that came from lesson number 11. We talked about how anatomy and physiology are related to each other. So the fact that some of the gray matter, some of the matter in the brain is gray, and some of the matter in the spinal cord is gray, comes from the fact that the gray matter has a lot less myelin. And that's why we started with our pun for the day, right? Myelin. Gray matter versus white matter, at the end of the day, it really just comes down to a difference in how much myelin they have. So when we talk about gray matter in the brain has a lot less myelin. White matter in the brain has a lot more myelin. So I can see a ton of myelin here when we're talking about the white matter of the brain. I see little or no myelin at all when we talk about the gray matter of the brain. Same thing applies then to the spinal cord. So I've got some areas that are the gray matter where I don't have a lot of myelin, and I have some areas with the white matter where I do have a lot of myelin. Now, you, I think, have the question here in lesson number 12, again, just like we had in lesson number 11. When we think about the spinal cord and we're looking at the white matter and the gray matter of the spinal cord, they look different, which means they're going to function differently as well. There are two kinds of functions that we'll see the spinal cord doing for us. One of the functions of the spinal cord is sending messages fast. That's one function of the spinal cord. The other function of the spinal cord is processing messages. When I talk about these two kinds of functions that the spinal cord does, excuse me, which of these functions would be better done by the white matter of the spinal cord? Would the white matter of the spinal cord be better at sending messages or processing messages? Exactly. The white matter of the spinal cord is going to be what helps me to send messages. The white matter sends messages really quickly. Remember when we talked about myelin back in lesson number 10, when we were talking about myelin, it covers up the axons of neurons, the part of a neuron that sends a message. So when I have a lot of myelin, I can send messages really quickly. So when you think about the spinal cord, all of these places here on the outside, where I have those things that in lab we call funiculi, and that in lecture we're calling tracts, the job of tracts, or the job of funiculi, is to send messages really fast, because the part of the neuron that I have there are my myelinated axons. So that means for me then that the parts of the spinal cord that have gray matter are going to be much better suited to do the processing that we're talking about with messages in the spinal cord. So later when we start talking about reflexes, these are things that your body can do without going up to the brain to figure out how to respond. The way that I'm able to do that is the fact that I have all of my processing parts of the neurons that live here. So big picture idea for us to know. We've got gray matter and white matter in the spinal cord. The white matter that I find on the outside, with all of that myelin, really good at sending messages. The gray matter that I find in the middle, really good at processing messages, or in the case of a reflex arc, for example, being able to process the message and figure out what I need to do with the message all at once without even having to go up to the brain. So white matter versus gray matter. Don't forget that stuff. And what I will mention too is we've now talked about what gray matter and white matter have, both in the context of the spinal cord and the brain. So a wink, wink, nudge, nudge for us that there's a real good chance that's going to show up on the final exam. So make sure we know that we've got cell bodies and dendrites in the gray matter. Make sure we know that we have myelinated axons in the white matter, and make sure we know the differences in their functions. The next picture that you guys have in your lecture packet shows you the different kinds of neurons that live in different places of the spinal cord, specifically in the gray horns. So we're looking at the different horns. Remember that here in the back we have the dorsal horn. Then here on the side we have the lateral horn. And here in the front we have the ventral horn. So 3 different horns, or 3 different collections of neurons that live in the spinal cord. Type of neuron, or the functional classification, let's use a lab word here, the functional classification of my neurons that live in these different places is different from each other. Now, I need you guys on your, so you've got this picture, right? We can see this picture here on your lecture outlines. This picture also has our little legend, I guess you call it, over here. We need you to go through with this legend is we need to do a little bit of underline, highlight, starring to help us out to interpret this picture here. So what I want you to underline, highlight, star in each of these descriptions is our functional classification. What I mean by that is my blue colored stuff, notice that my functional classification of those neurons are interneurons. And then my green colored stuff, they are also interneurons. We go down to the yellow and they are motor neurons. And the red stuff is also motor neurons. First really important thing for us to know when we're looking at this picture to help us out with our studying, we need to know those functional classifications. So interneurons are found in the blue part and the green part. My motor neurons are found in the yellow part and the red part. Okay, let's remind ourselves 2 of the ganglion is separate. This legend only applies to the gray matter horn. We will talk about the ganglion though. Yep, the ganglion is something that we must know for lab. We will talk about this ganglion as well. First we'll talk about the horns and then we'll go out to that ganglion out there. Let's remind ourselves, when I talk about interneurons, especially in lab when we talked about interneurons, what are some of the words that we use to describe what interneurons do? What's kind of the job of interneurons? Yeah, I love it. The two main words that came up for us, the first, the easy word for what it does is processing. Processing of information. The other word, the more technical word that relates to their name a little bit better, is integration. Integration is the same thing as processing. So when I talk about having interneurons that I find in my dorsal horn, that tells me that this horn here in the backside is a place where I do a lot of processing or integration, or we could even add the word maybe predicting, for predicting a response, figuring out what we should be doing based on the information that we got. The neurons that live in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord are my processing neurons. They're what we call the interneurons. Then we've got neurons that are called motor neurons. If you were to try to describe what a motor neuron does, what are some of the things we'd say for a motor neuron? Yeah, I like so some of our easy words for it, motor neurons are all about movement, right? Or they're about making things happen. So motor neurons, a lot of them are going to cause movement because motor neurons, remember, talk to muscle, so some kind of muscle movement. But occasionally it's not even just that I need a muscle to move. Sometimes the response that I should have is my body should release a hormone, for example. And so that would just be in general, like a couple of us put in the chat, that motor neurons make an action happen. That action might be a muscle movement, or that action might be that I spit out a hormone. Either way, making those kinds of things happen, that's the job of my motor neurons. Okay, so we've started by talking about the functional classifications, interneurons versus motor neurons. We talked about what those types of neurons do. We should mention, though, that there is one other functional classification of neurons that is missing from our list here. We did interneurons, we did motor neurons. Who's missing? What's the other functional classification of neurons? Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in here. That last kind that's missing, which when we talk about reflex arcs is the first kind that we care about. The last kind that's missing is called sensory neurons. Sensory neurons. When we talk about sensory neurons, what were some of the words that we used to describe their job? What do sensory neurons do? They're not processing, they're not doing movements. Yeah, so I like some of the words that I'm seeing up here. I'm seeing words like detecting. Let's see if I can spell. Detecting information, collecting information. Sensory neurons are my receivers, if you will. So sensory neurons collect my information, or they're detecting change happen around you. The big thing we said with our sensory neurons, if you remember, is that all sensory neurons can do is collect information. They can't do anything in terms of processing it. They can't do anything in terms of predicting what we should do about it. All a sensory neuron does is collect what's said out there. So sensory neurons, we did not talk about them living in the dorsal horn or living in the lateral horn or the ventral horn. Sensory neurons actually don't live in the spinal cord. And that would be an underline highlight star idea to make for yourself. Sensory neurons don't live in the spinal cord. I use that terminology a lot when I say blank neurons live in the ventral horn or lateral horn, etc. Horn. Okay. When I talk about living somewhere, this word live, the best way to think about it is where's the location of their cell body? Because remember, the cell body of a neuron is the place that actually makes the neuron do its job. So when we talk about the part of a neuron that actually matters for making it a sensory neuron or making it an interneuron or a motor neuron, it has to do with the location of its cell body. So when I talk about sensory neurons don't live, or their cell bodies are not found in the spinal cord at all. What is the location? See if we remember it from lab. Does anyone remember where the cell bodies of a sensory neuron live? Yeah, so Carrie mentioned it earlier, and she's chiming in with it again for us here. Right here is an underline highlight star structure, right here. The dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion. This is the location where sensory neurons live. So sensory neurons, my ones that collect information, that they detect what's happening around you, those ones live in the dorsal root ganglion. And by the way, I don't know if we emphasized this enough during our time yesterday when we were talking about parts of the spinal cord. This is a must-know structure. Here, I think I can even put a little box around it. Yeah, this must-know structure, dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion is this bump that I see on the back part of my branch that's going here into the spinal cord. We have attached to the spinal cord here what we call a dorsal root, which is a branch that goes here and attaches to the back side of the spinal cord. And we have what's called a ventral root, which is this structure that attaches here to the front side of the spinal cord. The dorsal root, the way you'll know it's on the back side of the spinal cord is because there's this big bump on it called a ganglion. I don't have a bump on the ventral root. So if you remember from the lab guided lesson, there were a couple of hints to help you out with identifying front versus back. This is the big one right here. Do I see the bump? Because if I see the bump, that's the back side. If I don't see the bump, that's the front side, like I see up here. No bump, that tells me it's on the back. We're generally pretty nice to you, and I'm sure we'll try to be pretty nice to you on our lab exam here, but if I were to accidentally put the model upside down in front of you, you would still be able to tell that because the ganglion is only ever on the back side. So if you ever happen to see the bump and it looks like it's right here, even if the bump looks like it's right here, that just tells me, oh, my spinal cord is flipped over. So dorsal root ganglion, absolutely must know this for lab because it helps me tell front from back. Reason we absolutely must know it for lecture is because this is the location of sensory neurons. Location of sensory neurons, the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, so here's what we've said so far. Sensory neurons, my neurons that detect information, they live in the backside, or this bump right here, called the dorsal root ganglion. They live in the root. They do not live in the spinal cord. What lives in the spinal cord are either my interneurons that do processing, or my motor neurons that do movement, or that make things happen. Now let's break down some of the other words that I see in their names to help us understand what this picture shows me. Let's start with our dorsal horn back here. And I'll ask you an easy question here. When I talk about the dorsal horn here in the back, remind me, what's the functional classification of the neurons that live back here? Who lives back here in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord? Yeah, so back here in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, this is the location of my interneurons. Remember we underlined that in our legend up here. My interneurons live back here. Remember what I said the word live means? It's where their cell bodies are. Interneurons, my processing neurons, live here in the dorsal horn. They live here in the backside of the spinal cord. Notice that we have two different colors or two different types of interneurons that live here in the dorsal horn. Some of them, if we go back to our legend over here, some of them say that they're receiving somatic sensory information. Somatic sensory information. Some of them say they're receiving visceral sensory information. So here's some terms that we should define for ourselves and know. The somatic word for one of them. Somatic technically means of the body, somatic. Technical definition that doesn't mean a lot. Maybe a better way to think about it is this is going to be things like your skin, your muscles. Basically, it's everything in your body except for what those visceral ones do for us. Does anyone remember from your reading or your studying, when I use that word visceral, visceral refers to what in your body? Yes, multiple of us are chiming in here. When I use this word visceral, visceral literally means organs. Organs. So any kind of sensory information that doesn't come from organs. So like I said, things like your skin, your muscles, your tendons, that is what we would call somatic sensory information. Visceral sensory information is the kind of information that comes from your organs. So examples of visceral sensory information, that's things like, oh, my stomach is grumbling, or things like, oh my gosh, I ate too much, or my blood sugar level has gotten higher, for example. Information that's coming from the organs, that's called visceral sensory information. Any other kind of sensory information is called somatic sensory information. So we can see up here from our description that different kinds of neurons process different kinds of information. Some of them are processing information from most of the body. Some of them only process information from the organs. So here in my dorsal horn, notice that information that comes from places like your skin goes a little bit more toward the backside of the dorsal horn. Information that comes from organs, like, here we go, my favorite system. What's my favorite, by the way? It's been a long time since I asked that. What's my favorite system? There we go. We're remembering. Perfect. My favorite question, right? My favorite system here. So any sensory information that comes from my favorite system here, that's going to be processed more toward the front side of the dorsal horn. But the big idea is everybody who lives in the dorsal horn is my processing neurons. That's the only place that processing neurons live. Sensory information comes in, and depending on where in the body it came from, whether it came from the skin, for example, or whether it came from the digestive system, I'll process it in slightly a different place, but I always do my processing here in the dorsal horn. Let's move up to our next horn here. The next one, as we're working our way toward the front, is the yellow one. The yellow one here is the first place that I see motor neurons. So we're talking about the lateral horn now. The lateral horn has motor neurons in it, but specifically these motor neurons are called visceral motor neurons. When I talk about visceral motor neurons, where do we think this motor information is going in the body? Based on this word visceral, what are these neurons controlling since they're visceral motor? Exactly. Yep, they are controlling the organs. So the organs like Letty mentioned, the heart and the lungs, organs like my favorite system, right? The digestive system. When we talk about visceral motor neurons, like somebody told me here, visceral motor neurons control two types of muscle in the body. Visceral motor neurons control, what are the two types of muscle tissue that visceral motor neurons control? Visceral motor neurons that are controlling the muscle tissues inside organs. Which kind of muscle tissues live inside organs? Okay, a couple of us have chimed in with the first one. Smooth muscle. Smooth muscle. That's the one that we find all up and down the GI tract, helping us to move our food. We also find this one in the lungs, controlling the size of the tubes in the lungs. The other type of muscle tissue that visceral motor neurons control is the other one that you don't decide when it contracts. We don't decide when smooth muscle contracts, and yes, we also do not decide when cardiac muscle contracts. Cardiac muscle. Okay, so over here, we're talking visceral motor neurons. These are the types of neurons that would regulate or control the contraction of smooth muscle, like in your blood vessels, like in the digestive system, like in the airways. These are also the types of neurons that would control cardiac muscle. Hey, there's only one place in the body that we have cardiac muscle. What's the one place in the body that has cardiac muscle tissue? Just one place. Yep, the only place in the body that we have cardiac muscle tissue is inside the heart. So we're talking about visceral motor neurons. We said the word visceral means organs. Between smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, there you have it. This is what they control, the types of muscle tissue inside organs. So if we're talking about making anything happen with smooth muscle contraction or cardiac muscle contraction. That's the job of visceral motor neurons. When we talk about somatic motor neurons then are going to control the only type of muscle tissue that we have left. Somatic motor neurons, what do we think? What type of muscle tissue would somatic motor neurons control? Ah, I like it. We got a biceps going on, right? That's pretty awesome. A place where we see it, absolutely. Somatic motor neurons are controlling skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue. So if I need to do a bicep curl, if I need to write some notes, if I need to raise my hand in class, all of those kind of things, when I'm causing the contraction of skeletal muscle tissue, the neurons that make that happen are the ones that live here in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So 3 horns in the spinal cord, 3 places where I find gray matter. The dorsal horn on the backside, the lateral horn on the outside, and the ventral horn on the front. We must know for the homework assignment and for the upcoming exam, we need to know which specific types of neurons live in these places. So this would be, remember from lecture, we talk about an underline highlight star image. Here's my underline highlight star image. Knowing who lives where, being able to describe what these neurons do. To help us with understanding all of this stuff that we just talked about, who controls what or what kind of information they've got, I'm going to flash up the activity that you have underneath this picture. And I'm going to make things a little bit uncomfortable for us here. I'm actually going to go off camera and off mic. And I'm going to give us about 4 or 5 minutes here. And I apologize, my words got really small. You have this in your lecture packet. We have a chat to chat up with our neighbors here. I want you guys to work together here over the next 4 to 5 minutes. Use the chat, kind of like you would if you were chatting with your neighbors in class. I'm going to make you guys go through, see if we can answer these questions. And then in a little bit here, I'll pop back in and we'll check our answers together. So this is Dr. Allis peacing out officially. Just for a couple of minutes here, I want to give you guys a chance to chat out which of those horns in the spinal cord would help us to do each of these functions. So how do we approach this? Number 1, we figure out which kind of neuron would do each of these jobs. Then number 2, we figure out where they live. So let's take some time and get to know our virtual neighbors here. Use that chat. Let's see if we can figure out the answers for these questions here. I like where our discussion has gone. I love that we've kind of been a little bit back and forth with talking about some of these different areas. I will tell you, I'll be honest with you, and we kind of landed on this here. This last one down here, right, was a little bit tricky for us. And it was on purpose that it was a little bit tricky. A couple of us mentioned this word detecting. When I use the word detecting, which functional classification of neurons did we say did detecting? Who's a detector? Yeah, so a couple of us are chiming in. My detectors are sensory neurons. Sensory neurons. When I talk about sensory neurons, where did I tell you guys that sensory neurons live? Their cell body. Sensory neurons live, yeah, they live in the dorsal root ganglion. Oops. Hey, if you want to write it really fast in your notes, you can call it the DRG. Dorsal root ganglion. I went tricky on you on purpose. I gave you one that the neuron that does this job doesn't actually live in the spinal cord, right? The dorsal root ganglion is that structure that I find outside the spinal cord on my way in. So I did go tricky on purpose on you to help us remember when I talk about detecting something, detecting is the job of a sensory neuron, and sensory neurons don't live in the spinal cord. So we use this word detecting to give us an idea of what the functional classification of my neurons were. That's perfect. I know I saw in the chat too, a couple of us honed in on this word right here, processing. Processing. When we talk about processing, what's the functional classification of neurons that do processing? Who's a processor? Yeah, those interneurons. Now we're talking interneurons. Don't have space by that one. Interneurons. Interneurons, all of my interneurons, my two types, we have interneurons that process visceral information, and we have interneurons that process somatic information. But regardless of which type of information you're processing, all of my interneurons live in the same place, in the spinal cord. What's that place that all of my interneurons live in the spinal cord? Which horn do all interneurons live inside of? Interneurons are always inside, I guess I'll put it here next to interneurons for us. They're always inside the dorsal horn. Always. Always dorsal. Now, when we look at our descriptions here, we're talking about temperature sensations. Temperature sensations, we would call that a somatic sensation. So let me add that note for us here. Ooh, down below. Try again. That's a somatic sensation. When we talk about how full our stomach is, now we're talking about an organ, that's going to be my visceral information. So when you're looking at that cross section, that picture from the last page, some of my interneurons process visceral sensory information. Some of my interneurons process somatic sensory information. But regardless of which kind of information they're processing, both of them live inside the dorsal horn. So always dorsal horn anytime you see this processing word. Or remember, the other word that we added to the list of what they do is predicting. Figuring out what we should do, that's the job of our interneurons. Okay, let's look at the ones that we have left. First one we have left is setting your heart rate. When we talk about your heart rate, that's how quickly your heart beats, right? What kind of tissue is it that actually beats when your heart beats? What's doing, how do you get a heartbeat? What's going on? Well, yeah, so you guys are jumping ahead of me. We know that this is a visceral motor neuron that helps me out to do this. This particular visceral neuron is controlling, yes, my cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle. When we talk about setting your heart rate or telling your cardiac muscle how quickly to contract, that's absolutely the job of visceral motor neurons. So visceral motor neurons, which of those horns do the visceral motor neurons live inside of? Visceral motor neurons found inside, yeah, one of us chimed in here. Visceral motor neurons, these are the ones that live in the lateral horn. Visceral motor neurons live in the lateral horn. So when talking about your heart rate, when we're talking about controlling an organ like your heart, that's the job of my neurons that live in the lateral horn. Hey, let's go down to this one down here. When I talk about regulating your blood pressure, when we're regulating your blood pressure, which kind of muscle tissue, do we know? Which kind of muscle tissue lives inside blood vessels and helps to set your blood pressure? Which type of muscle tissue is responsible for your blood pressure? Yes, several of us are chiming in. Your blood pressure comes from how contracted your smooth muscles are. Smooth muscles set blood pressure. So when I talk about my type of motor neuron that controls the smooth muscles, it's the same kind of motor neuron that controls cardiac muscle. Again, we have visceral motor neurons. Visceral motor neurons. And again, with the visceral motor neurons, where do those ones live? Where do those visceral motor neurons live? Which horn? Yeah, visceral motor neurons are the ones that live on the outside. They live in the lateral horn. So two different kinds of muscle tissue, like we talked about on the last page, cardiac muscle tissue and smooth muscle tissue. The neurons that control both of these types of tissues always found in the lateral horn. The last function that we have left then is moving your fingers, and you get to decide when your fingers move, which means that the type of muscle tissue inside your fingers is which kind of muscle tissue. Which one do you control that does contraction? Exactly. We control skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue. This is a function of skeletal muscle tissue. And remember that skeletal muscle tissue was controlled by somatic motor neurons. And which of those horns did the somatic motor neurons live inside of? If I'm a somatic motor neuron, yeah, I live in that ventral horn, the ventral horn. Okay, so we've gone through and given some specific examples of things that your body might need to do, or some of the process your body needs to do. We figured out which horn of the spinal cord would be responsible for each of these different things. You have this activity both in your lecture notes and you have it in the guided lesson. I thank you for not being the mean teacher. Yeah, I'll help you out here. But here's what I'll say. With these functions here, you can go through and quiz yourself on these functions. Don't just memorize them. Make sure we can think our way through, because I'm promising you on our next lecture exam, I'm going to give you some scenarios that are like these things, but a little bit different. We need to practice figuring out, okay, when we talk about the heart rate, what kind of tissue are we talking about? When we're talking about getting information from the stomach, what kind of information is that? Or when we're talking about blood pressure or texture. So please use this as a practice for yourself. Don't just memorize these answers, because you can go back into the guided lesson and quiz yourself on these things too. There's a no points assigned quiz inside the guided lesson to help you print these answers here. So use this as guidance, because I promise you on the exam, I'm not just going to ask you point blank, what's the location of visceral motor neurons? You know Dr. Allis, right? She's the mean teacher that makes you use your information. So make sure we can use our information. Happy to help you out and talk through this as a class. I appreciate that you guys did some work together to help you answer these questions. All right, how are we feeling about these types of neurons here? Thumbs up, thumbs down, dance party, questions, whatever we have. Let me get you your penguin, because I forgot to do a penguin yesterday. How are we feeling about the neurons that live in each of our horns? Let's get penguin up here. Got some thumbs up coming in. Got my little Addy cat that came in. No dance party today. Some of my dancing friends aren't here today, so that's probably why we're not having a dance party today. That's okay. There we go. Now we got some dancing going on. Yeah, so if you think of questions that we didn't cover related to this material, please feel free to put them in the chat later, or please feel free to email them back to me as well. We will have some time tomorrow too if we have some more questions about this. The rest of what I asked you guys to cover for class today was about reflexes. So I want to talk to you guys about some basic reflex information first, and then we'll work together on some of our specific reflexes. So we're going to go to a blank whiteboard here. When you talk about reflexes, so our big topic here is going to be reflexes. There are 3 different ways that we need to classify each of our reflexes. Help me out in your notes. I don't remember what order we talked about them in. What's the first 2 ways that we talked about classifying a reflex? Can someone help me out? I can't remember if it was like cranial spinal, polysynaptic, monosynaptic. Okay, so it was cranial spinal was the first one. Okay, perfect. Okay, number 1 was spinal versus cranial. Okay, what was the second way? I'm just going to make a big list here. What was the second way I told you guys to classify them? Was that monosynaptic, polysynaptic? I think mono and poly. Okay, monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. And then my third way that I asked you to classify them was ipsilateral versus contralateral. Contralateral. Okay. Here's what I'll tell you about reflexes. With reflexes, you don't have to memorize all the specific details of these reflexes. On the exam, I will give you a picture of reflexes and ask you to predict each of these things about it. So we're going to go through and define what each of these different things mean and what it would look like on pictures. And then we're going to work together as a class to go through the examples that you have in your packet here. So these 3 big ideas. If you can, you know how when we talk about muscle actions in lab, I always tell you guys, like, don't memorize the specific rule or the specific functions of each muscle, memorize the rules. Well, here's my rules for reflexes. If we memorize these rules here with our reflexes, we will be able to interpret the pictures that I give you. I promise you 100%. So here we go. First way that we classify reflexes is whether they are spinal or cranial. So if I am classifying a reflex based on whether it's spinal or cranial, technically what I am classifying that reflex based on is, so here, classifying my reflex, and I can't spell this morning. Letty said she needs coffee too. It's really sad. I had my coffee this morning and I still am not surviving. Okay, so classifying my reflex based on the location of integration. The location of integration. We almost got like a Schoolhouse Rock thing going on, right? So conjunction, junction. Very few of us will catch that reference, but a few of us will. So the location of integration. When I classify reflexes, the first thing that I'm classifying them based on is where I do my processing. So am I processing that information? Here, I'm going to make you guys do this because I know you can. If I'm a spinal reflex, where am I processing my information? If I'm a spinal reflex, I promise it's not a trick question. Where are we processing our information based on its name? Some of you are like, she's being real tricky. I promise I'm not. A spinal reflex, I am processing my information in the spinal cord. The spinal cord. When we talk about reflexes, some of them are processed entirely just in the spinal cord. So a spinal reflex, we don't have to go to the brain. We don't have to go to the brainstem. We are staying entirely inside the spinal cord. Cranial reflexes are a little bit dicier. Cranial reflex, I'm going to help you out with these ones. When I talk about a cranial reflex, I am not talking about going all the way to the brain, so I'm not going all the way up to the cerebrum, but I am going up to the part of the brain called the brainstem. Brainstem. I know it's been a little while since we talked about the brainstem in lab, but it would be good for us to remind ourselves here. When I talk about the brainstem, there are 3 structures that are inside the brainstem. So the first structure of the brainstem, let's mention, is the structure that the spinal cord attaches to. Does anyone remember the name of the structure that the spinal cord attaches to? Yeah, so a couple of us are chiming in. My spinal cord, the first brainstem structure that it's attached to is called the medulla oblongata. So if I process my information, or if I do integration in the medulla oblongata, that's called a cranial reflex. Up above the medulla oblongata is the big bump structure, whose name means the bridge. Yeah, we all like that one, right? We all like the pons. So my second brainstem structure is the pons. There is one more brainstem structure that has those colliculi, or has those bumps on it. Yeah, Ashley's chiming in for me. My last brainstem structure is the midbrain. Last structure is the midbrain. If I process my information, so my location of processing or of integration, if I process that information in the medulla oblongata, in the pons, in the midbrain, any of these are brainstem structures, I call that a cranial reflex. Otherwise, if I process that information in the spinal cord, I'm going to call that a spinal reflex. Now, how are we going to tell where I process the information? Well, it's super easy. When you're looking at a picture of the reflex, if you see a spinal cord, that's a spinal reflex. It's as simple as that. If you see something that looks really funky, you may or may not identify it as the brainstem, but if it looks funky and it doesn't look like the spinal cord, that's going to be a cranial reflex. Because see, here's the thing with reflexes. Reflexes do not involve the cerebrum. They do not involve the part of your brain that you consciously process things. So even if I have a cranial reflex, we're not going all the way up to the brain like you normally think about it. We never go all the way up to the cerebrum. We only ever go to the brainstem, which are these structures we listed here. Or for most of the reflexes in the body, we just do the reflex in the spinal cord itself. So it just happens inside that spinal cord. So for every reflex that we look at, as we're going to pull up some pictures here, every reflex I look at, the first thing you need to be able to identify is if it's a spinal reflex or a cranial reflex. And again, that's just literally based on, do I see a spinal cord or do I not see a spinal cord? That's the first way I have to classify my reflexes. The second way that I have to classify my reflexes are whether they are monosynaptic or polysynaptic. Both of these have the word or the ending part synaptic in them. Synaptic refers to a synapse. Synapse. Who can describe for me what a synapse is? Or what happens at a synapse? Here's a lesson number 10 thing for us. What's going on at a synapse? Yeah, I like it. Synapses are about talking. They're about communication. So a synapse is a place where two neurons meet. Neurons meet. This is where they do their talking. This is where messages are passed. However you want to think about it, when I talk about a synapse, this is always the place where I do communication. Now, I promise, again, this is not a trick question here. Yeah, it's the water cooler. I like that. It's the water cooler for neurons where they're going to swap information, but hopefully not swap coronavirus, right? None of us are huddling around water coolers these days. Okay, so we got monosynaptic and polysynaptic. Let's start with poly. This poly beginning part here, does anyone know what poly means? The beginning part, poly. More than one or many, so multiple. Or essentially two or more. Two or more. Polysynaptic. I have two places where neurons meet, or 2, 3, 4, I might have more than that, places where my neurons can pass on messages. Polysynaptic. So let's take a guess then. When I talk about mono, what might that beginning part mono mean? Any ideas? Yeah, mono just means one. Mono means one. Okay, so every reflex is either monosynaptic, meaning there is one synapse, or it is polysynaptic, meaning there's multiple. There's at least two, possibly more than that. How are we going to be able to classify our neurons based on this? You can go through and you can literally count the number of neurons. Hey, here's where I get to draw neurons for you, since we weren't in class together, so we didn't get to do our neurons. Okay, so here's my awesome little neuron here. Let's draw it out. Look at how great that neuron looks. I'm doing so much better at drawing these days with my mouse here. Okay, here's one neuron. Here's its neighbor neuron here. Right here, let's say that this is my reflex arc. Would I say that this is a monosynaptic reflex or a polysynaptic reflex as drawn right here? What do we got going on here? Yeah, this one would be considered a monosynaptic reflex because here's my one synapse, right? My one place where neurons talk to each other, a monosynaptic reflex. If I add in an extra neuron over here, another neuron coming this way, now I have another synapse. Now I've become a polysynaptic reflex. Some of the pictures of reflexes that we'll look at, we actually might have a couple of neurons that are found at this synapse here. So I've got more than one neuron that gets information from this particular neuron. It might be talking to more than one different neuron. Once I add in an extra communication point, at least one more, now I've added in two communication points, I've become polysynaptic. Now, in monosynaptic reflexes, we said I have one synapse. I have one place where neurons talk to each other. For my friends who have had a chance to work through this part of the lesson, in a monosynaptic reflex, I am missing one type of one functional classification of neurons. If I am a monosynaptic reflex, who's missing? Monosynaptic reflexes are missing. I guess only one of us knows. That's okay. We're missing interneurons. In a monosynaptic reflex, we go straight from my sensory neuron that collects information straight to a motor neuron if I'm in a monosynaptic reflex. I skip out on an interneuron because I only have one place where my neurons are meeting, or only one place where they're talking to each other. So if you have a monosynaptic reflex, there's no interneurons. Most of the reflexes in the body are polysynaptic, which means that I am actually going to have an interneuron, and that interneuron is going to then synapse with motor neurons. So most of the reflexes in the body, when you go through and you count the number of neurons they have, they'll have a sensory neuron, number 1, an interneuron, number 2, and then at least one motor neuron, number 3. Sometimes more than one motor neuron, like I see in this example here. But if you have a monosynaptic reflex, if I only have one place where neurons are talking to each other, it does me no good to just have a sensory neuron talk to an interneuron, because remember, interneurons just process. They don't make anything happen. So monosynaptic reflex, no interneuron, as we have that. Last way I can classify my neurons is either as ipsilateral or contralateral. Ipsilateral or contralateral. Your tip off here with these, let's start with our ending part here. Lateral. Lateral means side. So lateral means we're on a side. There are two options for sides when we're talking about these reflexes. We can have something that is ipsilateral or something that is contralateral. So we'll break down our beginning parts here. Let's start with the beginning part, contra. Does anyone happen to know contra? Do we think that would mean the same or opposite? Contra. Yeah, contra is going to mean opposite. It's going to mean on the other side. If someone's being contrarian, like my 3-year-old loves to be sometimes, contra or contrarian means we're going against the flow. We're being opposite. So a contralateral reflex is going to send out motor directions on the opposite side that sensory information came in. The beginning part, ipsi, means that it's on the same side. So if I have a reflex that sensory information comes in on the left side of the spinal cord and motor information goes out the left side of the spinal cord, that's a lateral reflex. If I have a reflex where information comes in on the left and then some or all of the motor information goes out the right side, I would call that a contralateral reflex. Again, the way you tell this when you're looking at a reflex is we just look at the spinal cord. Which direction do those motor neurons go? Do they always go out the same side, or are some of them going out of the opposite side as well? Ipsilateral versus contralateral. My two different classifications there based on size. Okay, so big picture. Every single reflex that we chat our way through here during the rest of our class, there are 3 words you need to know about it. Is it a spinal reflex or a cranial reflex? That's going to be based on where I'm doing the processing. Is it a monosynaptic reflex or a polysynaptic reflex? That's going to be based on the number of neurons. And finally, is it ipsilateral or contralateral, which is going to be based on the sides of the spinal cord or the sides of the brainstem that I send my directions out of. 3 ways we have to classify each of our reflexes here. Let me pull up our reflexes, and I'm going to have you guys help me work my way through them here. So, first reflex that I ask you guys to know about on our lesson here. First reflex is called the patellar reflex. The patellar reflex is a reflex that, the way I like to think about it, is this is what you use to kick your doctor. Your doctor is rude and taps your knee, and in response you kick them. Say, wait a minute, why did you do that to me? So, patellar reflex, what we use to kick our doctor. There were 3 ways we had to classify things: cranial versus spinal, mono versus poly, and ipsi versus contralateral. I'll put the whole word there. Okay, so help me out in the chat. When I am talking about classifying cranial versus spinal, this is the location where I do processing. So cranial versus spinal. What do we think from our picture here of the patellar reflex? Would this be cranial or spinal based on our picture? Yeah, absolutely right. This is a great example of a spinal reflex. Spinal reflex. I know that it's a spinal reflex because I literally have this huge spinal cord that I can see in the middle of my picture here. So, not a trick question if I ask you cranial versus spinal, spinal cord right here. Okay, first way I have to classify it. Second way I have to classify it, is it monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Remember, for these ones, we're looking at the number of synapses, places where neurons meet. So, monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Can we tell? Yes, several of us have chimed in. Not everybody, but several of us have chimed in. We're saying that it's monosynaptic. Monosynaptic. Somebody pointed out it did actually tell us that. That is correct. If it on the exam, it wouldn't tell us that, right? On the exam, that'd be covered up. But when we're talking about our types of reflexes, monosynaptic versus polysynaptic, we got to look at the number of places where our neurons meet. I've got a synapse right here. I just tried to circle it. I circled it poorly, so hopefully you can see it better in your notes. I have one place where this blue neuron is synapsing with this black neuron right here. One place where we're talking to each other. One place where they meet. I don't have any other places where neurons meet. I have the place where I detect my information up here. I have the place where I send out my directions down here, but I do not have another place where information is exchanged. This is an example of a monosynaptic reflex because I only have one place where neurons talk to each other. Hey, let's remind ourselves, if I am a monosynaptic reflex, which functional classification of neuron do I not have? Which type of neuron do I not have since this is a monosynaptic reflex? Yes, lots of us are telling us here in our chat here that we are missing an interneuron. We're missing an interneuron. When you are working on the lab this week, we didn't talk a lot about reflexes during our class time yesterday. But it talks about how the patellar reflex is pretty much the fastest reflex in the body. Part of why it's so fast is because I have no interneuron. I do no processing. As soon as you detect that your muscle is stretching, because the doctor tapped on it with the hammer, as soon as you detect that, we know right away that I'm going to go down and I'm going to tell my muscle that it's time to contract, to get rid of that stretching. So don't have to process it. I don't have to think about it at all. This is a monosynaptic reflex. There's no interneuron. There's no processing. I go straight from a sensory neuron up here down into my motor neuron that goes back out and communicates. Hey, by the way, here is the cell body on my sensory neuron up here. When I talk about the cell body on my sensory neuron, where did we say that my sensory neurons live? What's this location called where this cell body lives? Here. It's not inside the spinal cord. Yeah, it's on the outside. I told you guys our quick abbreviation for it, right, was the DRG, the Dorsal Root Ganglion. the dorsal root ganglion. I could draw my little ganglion around it. So we got a little bump here on the outside. Here's that bump that goes into the backside of the spinal cord. So I've got a sensory neuron that lives in the dorsal root ganglion. I completely skip my dorsal horn because there's no interneuron. I go straight down into that ventral horn because we're contracting skeletal muscle down here. So we're missing our interneuron. We're doing a monosynaptic reflex. Last way we had to classify this reflex, is it ipsilateral or is it contralateral? This was all about the side that information came in and left. Ipsilateral, contralateral. What do we think? Yeah, we're doing the same side, right? So same side is when we use that funky word ipsilateral. Ipsilateral. Same side. Because my sensory information comes in on this side of the spinal cord, I synapse with a motor neuron that lives on the same side of the spinal cord and sends information out on the same side of the spinal cord. Pilar had the question, what is the stimulus for this reflex? Can anyone help us out? What's the stimulus for this reflex here? Who knows what the stimulus is? Exactly. Yep. The stimulus for this reflex, the doctor comes in and taps your knee. What you're actually detecting, what kind of sensory information makes this happen is the stretch. So we're detecting stretch information. Notice that my sensory neuron is called a stretch receptor. So it's detecting specifically the stretching of this muscle. And my response to this muscle stretching is, well, I'm going to contract it to make sure it doesn't stretch too far. So the last thing that we need to know about each of our reflexes is that stimulus. And your guided lesson walks you through for each of the reflexes to help you figure out what that stimulus is. Let's look at another reflex. Next reflex that we need to know is called the flexor withdrawal reflex. The flexor withdrawal reflex. I know that we're all very desperate for entertainment, right? Because we're locked at home. But here's what I will tell you. Playing with fire is never the answer. So please do not stick your finger in a flame. I promise you it will hurt. So flexor withdrawal reflex is what we would use if we accidentally touch the flame. We're not doing this on purpose, right? Even though we're bored, we're not doing this one. Okay, I'm going to make a list up here at the top. And I'm going to leave it to my chat here. I want you guys to chat this out. Cranial versus spinal. Monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. And ipsilateral versus contralateral. All right, let me put it to the chat. Explain your answers to each other. What kind of reflex is the flexor withdrawal reflex? Let's chat this out with our class here in the virtual classroom. Okay, so I'm seeing some good chat here to help us go through and identify things. So let's go through and put in some of the stuff that we seem to have agreed on. I think for the most part, we're all agreeing that for my first classification, this is a spinal reflex. This is a spinal reflex. Remember, the way that we can tell we've got a spinal reflex is we can see our spinal cord. So my spinal cord is here in my image. This is a spinal reflex. I know we had some debate here and some discussion. Monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. Let's chat this out again to help ourselves out. When I talk about a monosynaptic reflex, what does this word literally mean? Monosynaptic literally means, yep, we've got one synapse, one place where neurons meet. So polysynaptic literally means that I have more than one place where my neurons meet. I saw a great comment in our chat here about polysynaptic. Anytime you see an interneuron, that is always polysynaptic. So that would be a good note for us to make for ourselves. Anytime there is an interneuron, it's polysynaptic. See if that word fits. It's polysynaptic. Okay, so in this picture, I can see an interneuron. They even labeled it for us here. That's one way to know that this is polysynaptic. The other way to know that it's polysynaptic, though, is this word literally means more than one synapse. More than one synapse. So let's find our synapses here. My first synapse, the first place where neurons meet, I have a sensory neuron, or they're calling it an afferent neuron. It's the same thing. That meets up with my interneuron. That is one synapse. That interneuron processes the information and passes it on to a motor neuron. There's my second synapse. Because I have more than one, polysynaptic means I have at least two. Because I have more than one synapse, this would be a polysynaptic reflex. Yeah, so Carrie mentioned she thought there had to be more than one neuron that are found at a synapse. It doesn't have to be, no. As long as there's just multiple synapses, it's considered polysynaptic. We'll look at one that's a little more crazy, where there is more than one neuron that come off of our synapse over here, but it doesn't have to be. It can be simple, kind of like we see with this one. So we said it's a spinal reflex because I see a spinal cord. Awesome. We said that it's polysynaptic because I have these two synapses that we found right here. And I know we had some discussion here, ipsilateral versus contralateral. Let's do a little vote here in our chat again. Do we think ipsilateral or contralateral? Where do we feel like we ended up on this one? Ipsilateral or contralateral? Yeah, so we're agreeing, we're ending up on ipsilateral. Ipsilateral. Remember, ipsilateral means it happens same side. So ipsilateral, I've got my sensory information coming in over here on this side of my spinal cord, and my motor information going out that same side of the spinal cord. Ashley makes a good point for us too, that the goal of this reflex is the same hand that detected the stimulus, the same hand that detected technically, because I saw some debate on this, technically my stimulus is pain. When I talk about pain, by the way, pain just equals a lot of whatever. In this case, a lot of heat. If I get too much heat, that registers as pain. So the stimulus on this one is pain. I've got way too much heat because I'm touching a flame. That registers as pain. This would be another way to tell that this is an ipsilateral reflex, is the fact that the side that detected the heat or detected the pain is the same side going to respond. My motor neuron here is going to the same place as my sensory neuron was. So if the same side of your body responds, as was the side that detected the stimulus, we would call that an ipsilateral reflex. So we've got a spinal reflex, just like before. Unlike before, this one's a polysynaptic reflex. I have more than one synapse. And this is another example of an ipsilateral reflex on the same side of the body. The side that detected it is the side that responds. All right, I'm going to put another one up for us to chat out again. Yeah, so Carrie asked, what does it do? Yeah, it allows you to pull away your hand. So we're touching something hot. Obviously, my picture here shows me touching a candle. Again, that's not recommended. But what's likely to happen in real life, for example, is you accidentally touch a hot burner or touch a hot baking dish. Anything that you touch that is too hot, or conversely, if somebody's playing with dry ice, it's really too cold and registers as pain, this one would also help us to do that too. So pulling your hand away from that really hot or really cold stimulus, that's what the flexor withdrawal reflex does for you. All right, my next reflex for us to chat out together in our little chat bubble there. Here we go. You thought it was a Bunsen burner. It kind of looks like a Bunsen burner, right, Kelly? Or Carrie, it kind of does, yeah. Okay, let me put up another one here. Let's put up our text as usual. Cranial versus spinal. Mono versus poly. And C versus contra. All right, let's chat this one out together again in our chat box as well. So I'm gonna give you a chance here. Let's fight this one out too. All right, so it looks like we've mostly settled on things. So we'll go through here and fill in our questions to help us make our list here. So the first thing that it looks like we pretty much all agreed on, and it's the simplest here, this would be a cranial or spinal reflex. Which kind of reflex is this one that we see here? Is this cranial or spinal? Yeah, looks like we all agreed. And literally we said in our chat that this is a spinal reflex because I can see the spinal cord. Like, I promise it's as simple as that. If you see the spinal cord, it's a spinal reflex, absolutely. Second way that we had to classify it was whether it was monosynaptic or polysynaptic. What did we think on that one? Monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Yeah, we all pretty much seem to agree on this one. This is definitely polysynaptic. This is one like Carrie was asking about. Do we have to have more than one neuron synapsing at different places? We don't have to, but we absolutely can. We had the question of whether this, what color my interneurons were. Yes, all these little yellow ones that we see here that are synapsing with various purple motor ones, all of these are interneurons. So check this out. My sensory neuron shown here in green brings its information in, and then my sensory neuron's axon actually branches 3 different ways. Those 3 different ways allow it to interact with 3 different interneurons. One of those interneurons even splits and interacts with another 2 motor neurons. So this is absolutely a great example of a polysynaptic reflex because there's a ton of different neurons that are involved in this. So I bring in that sensory information, tell it to a bunch of interneurons, and they tell it to a bunch of motor neurons, and we've got it. Last question is if this is an ipsilateral or contralateral reflex. What do we think on this one? Did we decide it was ipsilateral or contralateral on this one? Yeah, so a bunch of us are chiming in. This is our best example of a contralateral reflex. Contralateral reflex. This is the reflex that I told you guys in the guided lesson, and I mentioned it yesterday. I like to call this one the Lego reflex. The Lego reflex. How many of us have ever stepped on a Lego? Anybody? Surely there's been several of us that have stepped on a Lego. Yeah. Oh man, stepping on Legos. Yep. Yeah. Letty raised her hand for me. Stepping on Legos is the worst. Oh my goodness. I think I've told you guys in lab, I had 3 younger brothers. So Legos all over the place all the time. So imagine that, I mean, our picture shows me a nail. That's really painful too, right? But if we want to be a little less gruesome here, let's imagine that, that this is a little Lego down here. When you start to step on that pointy edge of the Lego, we realize very quickly, I do not want to step on this. So the first thing I need to do is this foot that was stepping on the Lego, we need to lift this foot up. We want to make sure that I don't step all the way down on that because, man, put your whole weight on that, terrible. But the other thing that needs to happen when you start lifting this foot up so it doesn't step on the Lego is I need my other foot to catch me because I would argue probably the only thing worse than stepping on a Lego would be like falling on a Lego on the floor. I've never experienced that, thankfully, but I feel like that would be just terrible. So I not only need this foot to lift up, I need the other foot to press down and to catch me. Hopefully the other foot's not also standing on a Lego, right? Because that would be real sad. So the crossed extensor reflex allows you to take one foot off the Lego and catch yourself with the other foot so you don't fall down on top of the Legos. So this is my best example of what we call a contralateral reflex. Some of my motor directions go out the same side, but I also have to respond with the opposite side of the body. That's what makes it contralateral. The opposite side is involved as well. Yeah, somebody mentioned I'm having a boy. Yes, there will be Legos again. Legos will come back to my life. So I got to protect my poor feet from the Legos when they start coming out. Yeah, so we have a question in the chat. What happens because of the cross extensor reflex? Can we describe it briefly? I know I kind of gave a convoluted description. What's a fast way of describing what this reflex does? Can anyone help us out with that question in the chat? What does this reflex allow us to do in the body? Okay, so mention of balance, kind of, yeah. Ooh, I like that description of it. Yeah, this might be a good one to think of about shifting weight. That's a good way to think about it. So I've got pain on one side. I don't want my body weight on top of this pain. I want it going to the other side of the body where it's a little bit safer. So I don't want to fall over. I want to balance. I want to shift my weight from where I'm standing on something painful to where I wouldn't be standing on something painful. So yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. So the idea of shifting weight to help me balance and hopefully not crush my foot on that Lego or crush my foot on a nail. That would be bad news too. Yeah, thinking about walking on hot sand, right? Man, right about now though, I'm just saying, like, I would totally take some hot sand at a beach right now. Oh, I could use a beach, right? Anybody else could use a beach? Or is it just me? I would venture, yeah, I was gonna say, I'd venture to bet it is not just me. A beach, even like, you guys know I came from Oklahoma. So in Oklahoma, like, obviously we don't have beaches, but we have like lakes. So, you know, I would even take like an Oklahoma lake that's like not even that scenic and pretty, but like, man, just anywhere. But yeah, beach with some nice waves, that would be amazing right about now. So we can all dream together, right? I never did meet the Tiger King. I haven't had a chance to watch his special either. I've been busy. But yeah, maybe someday. I think I've seen ads actually for the Tiger King, or I used to see ads when we were driving places for his like cat sanctuary, I think. I don't know, because I remember seeing some really creepy billboards on the side of the road when we were driving between Texas and Oklahoma. So I don't know much about it, about that documentary, because, you know, it's a little busy right now on my side. But maybe when it's all said and done, I can watch Tiger King and learn about my fellow Oklahoma person. Yeah, and I second the idea of a Mai Tai or something like that on the beach. Absolutely. Like, I joke with my co-coordinator for the lab class. We're joking that whenever restaurants open up again and whenever I've had her and I like actually need to go out and like get a margarita, like actually do happy hour and be like, somehow we survived this transition online. Yeah, Carrie's like, just do the tequila, right? We're about to that point in the semester. Like, just do it. So, yeah, just take the whole picture, bring it on, right? That sounds about right. Yeah, remember in weeks we're all raising our virtual glass of something, right? So we'll raise our virtual glass together of making it through the semester. So just 3 more weeks. All right, one last reflex to talk about today, and then we're going to call it good. Here's my last one here. So let's go through. It was cranial to spinal. It was monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. And our final one was ipsilateral versus contralateral. Let's do this one. We'll do this one together. I guess I was spelling it right. First part of our classifications here, we want to know if it's cranial versus spinal. When I look at my picture over here, do I see a spinal cord? Yes, they're saying cranial. Yep. Yeah, we're going to call this a cranial reflex because when I look at this picture here, I may not have any idea what it is, but I know it's not the spinal cord. So it's very obvious in all of our other reflexes, right, that we've seen the spinal cord. This is an example of a cranial reflex. Cranial reflex. Now, in particular, the place that we're at, the part of the brainstem we're actually in, this is actually the pons right here. I wouldn't require you to be able to identify this by any means, that this is the pons. But what I would require you to be able to identify is that this is not the spinal cord. That's all we got to know. So this is a cranial reflex because what's happening is not happening inside the spinal cord. Next way that we had to classify this was monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. Can we tell if this one is monosynaptic or polysynaptic? I got 2 votes, 1 each way. Help me out. Would this be monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Yeah, this one is actually a polysynaptic. Here is one synapse right here. Here is another synapse right there. This is a polysynaptic reflex. There's more than one synapse, polysynaptic. Okay, And then the last way we had to classify was ipsilateral versus contralateral. Are we sending information out the same side or the opposite? Yep, we're all landing together here on ipsilateral. Ipsilateral. The side that my sensory information is coming in to the brainstem is the same side that that sensory information is out of the brainstem. So it is ipsilateral. Yeah, we were having a discussion here in the comments. What is it that we're seeing right here? I do think this looks suspiciously like a makeup brush. I'm going to call this a makeup brush. So the blinking reflex is when you're trying to do liquid eyeliner. I completely fail at that. Like, there's no way. It doesn't work for me. So if I'm trying to do liquid eyeliner and I accidentally end up with my eyeball, I like what Mary Lou said. The other option could be that, yes, we've been watching Bob Ross videos and we accidentally decided to paint our eye. So it does look suspiciously like some kind of brush. So yeah, we might need a smaller brush to do the liquid eyeliner, right? Maybe that's my problem. It's not small enough. But whatever this stimulus is for me, or whatever this exact thing is for, what I'm detecting in the blinking reflex is a touch sensation. I'm detecting what's touching my cornea in particular, so the outer front part of your eye. What's cool about this, or at least it's cool to Dr. Ollis because I'm a nerd here, touch sensations from your cornea actually go back to your brain using cranial nerve number 5. So here's where we tie lab and lecture together. Cranial nerve number 5, or the way we do it in Roman numerals is my V here. Cranial nerve number 5, oops, is called the trigeminal nerve, When we talk about cranial reflexes, sensory information always goes back to the stem through a cranial nerve. So cranial nerve number 5, one of the functions that it does is it detects touch information from the cornea. So when that paintbrush, when that eyeliner brush, whatever, touches the cornea, that sends information back to the brainstem, specifically to the pons, through cranial nerve number 5. I've got an interneuron that lives inside the pons that detects, oh my gosh, something's touching my eyelid. So we send motor directions out to close our eyes using cranial nerve number 7. So put this right here. Cranial nerve number 7. That's what VII is, 7. Cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve. One of the things that this nerve does for us is it controls the muscle orbicularis oculi. Here's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that this is the muscle that closes the eyelids. So you can see that this motor neuron that branches out here goes to the top part of orbicularis oculi, and it goes to the bottom part of orbicularis oculi to cause both parts to contract and make your eye blink. Blinking to close our eye, so whatever kind of brush or mascara wand or whatever it is that we put in here, it's no longer touching the cornea. Hey, what I will say about this reflex too, fun fact about this reflex, the other thing that can trip this reflex is for anyone who wears contacts. Do I have any contacts wearers? You can always hold your hand for me or tell me yes if you're a contacts person. Yeah, so there's a few of us here that wear contacts. I wear contacts. My husband swears that he will never wear contacts in his entire life. For some people, this reflex is really strong, so it's really hard for them to have anything touching the cornea. But what I will say for any friends that do wear contacts, even if putting in your contacts doesn't trip this blinking reflex, man, if you've ever put one in that has a small tear in it, or that it gets folded on your eyeball, oh my goodness, like that is the worst thing in the world. So we can trip that blinking reflex even if we're used to having something touching our cornea. It is still possible to trip this reflex as well. All right, It is 11:27, which is about the end of our office hours. This is where I wanted you guys to get to today. So what I want you guys to try to work on between now and tomorrow is finishing up the rest of lesson number 12. So we talked all about what's going on in the gray matter of the spinal cord. What I need you guys to work on between now and tomorrow's office hours is what's going on in the white matter of the spinal cord. So learning about those tracks. And then we get to go into a bunch of really cool disease correlations. So we're going to learn a little bit in this lesson about ALS. If you remember back from the ice bucket challenge, that's what that was for ALS. Also going to learn about shingles, learn about epidurals and spinal taps. So I want you to go through and try to finish up lesson number 12 to get us ready for tomorrow. And remember that Friday is our big lab review day. So be thinking about some of the lab topics we want to talk about on Friday. Before I stop our recording, let me ask really fast if there are any last minute questions about the content that we covered today. Any last minute questions about reflexes or horns or anything like that? Or you can give me a thumbs up if we're feeling okay about this stuff. Oh, we're dancing. I like it. Got some thumbs up. Got some dancing. All right, well, I'll probably go ahead and end the recording. Emily asked a quick question. When we talk about the lateral gray horn, my friends here in class today help me out. The lateral gray horn, the neurons that live there in that part of the spinal cord, what do those neurons activate? That's what the word innervate means. What do they control? If I live in the lateral gray horn, yeah, those are called visceral motor neurons. So they control two types of things in the body, two types of tissues. Visceral motor neurons control two types of muscle tissue. Yes, the smooth muscle tissue and the cardiac muscle tissue. Yeah, visceral motor neurons do smooth muscle tissue and cardiac muscle tissue. That's their jobs, absolutely. All right, well, I'm going to close down the recording and stick around here for just a little bit. So goodbye to my friends on the recording.